Imagine waking up tomorrow, but something is terribly wrong. Your bed is gone. Your room is gone. Even your house seems to have disappeared. Then you look down and realize the truth. You've become the size of an ant. At first, it might sound like an incredible superpower. You could lift objects many times your own body weight. You could survive falls that would normally kill you, and the smallest drops of water would suddenly become enormous. But there's a catch. At ant size, almost everything about your world would change. Your strength, your breathing, your senses. Even something as simple as walking through a puddle could become a life or death challenge. So what would actually happen if a human suddenly became the size of an ant? Let's start with the part that sounds the most fun. Leafcutter ants are famous for carrying objects several times their own body weight. Imagine seeing an ant pick up something that, relative to its size, would be like a human carrying a very heavy piece of furniture. So if you suddenly became ant-sized, would you become super strong? In a way, yes. And the reason isn't magic. It's physics. As an animal gets smaller, its body weight decreases faster than the cross-sectional area of its muscles. That means a tiny animal can have a surprisingly large amount of muscle relative to its body mass. It's one reason ants can perform feats of strength that look completely impossible to us. So at ant scale, something that feels impossibly heavy to a human could become surprisingly manageable. You wouldn't necessarily be able to casually lift an actual car, but compared with your new body weight, your strength-to-weight ratio could be extraordinary. For once, being tiny would actually be an advantage. Now let's say you climb to the top of a building. And because you've apparently forgotten every rule of self-preservation, you fall. Normally, that would be catastrophic. But at ant size, something strange happens. Falling becomes much less dangerous. That's because your mass becomes extremely small. As an object gets smaller, its weight decreases faster than its surface area. And that means air resistance becomes much more important compared with gravity. Your body would quickly slow down as you fell. Instead of hitting the ground at the terrifying speed of a falling human, your tiny body could reach a much lower terminal velocity. This is why tiny insects can fall from surprisingly high places and simply keep walking afterward. It's also why a small animal can survive a fall that would be devastating for a much larger one. So if you were ant-sized, a fall from a skyscraper might sound terrifying, but the impact itself could be surprisingly harmless. The real danger might be much simpler. What happens when you finally land? And here's where things get much less fun. Breathing. Humans breathe using lungs, but insects don't have lungs like ours. Instead, they use a system of tiny openings called spiracles. These openings connect to a network of tubes called trachea, which deliver oxygen throughout the body. It's an incredibly efficient system for a tiny creature. But there's a reason you don't see insects the size of dogs. The tracheosystem works particularly well at small body sizes. As an insect gets larger, transporting enough oxygen through those tiny tubes becomes increasingly difficult. So if you suddenly shrank to the size of an ant, your human lungs wouldn't necessarily become the perfect solution. Your entire relationship with oxygen would change. At that scale, the way insects move and exchange gases becomes much more important. In other words, being tiny might save you from falling, but it wouldn't magically turn your human body into an insect. Now, imagine you're walking through a forest after it rains. You see something ahead, a tiny puddle. To you, it looks harmless, but remember, you're the size of an ant. That puddle might as well be a lake. And even worse, water doesn't behave the way you would expect at your new size. For tiny creatures, surface tension becomes incredibly important. At our scale, water flows and splashes easily. But to a tiny insect, the surface of a water droplet can behave almost like a flexible membrane. That's why insects such as water striders can actually walk across the surface of water. To an ant-sized human, a single raindrop could be a serious obstacle. Imagine a giant blob of water suddenly crashing toward you. It wouldn't feel like a little drop. It could push you, trap you, or stick to your body. And if enough water surrounded you, escaping could become extremely difficult.
So forget about walking through heavy rain. At ant size, rain could become a survival challenge. But perhaps the strangest change would be your senses. Humans depend heavily on vision. We use our eyes to recognize people, read signs, find food, and navigate through the world. Ants operate very differently. Many ants have relatively weak vision and rely heavily on their antennae, touch, and sense of smell. Their antennae aren't just for decoration. They're packed with sensory receptors that help ants detect chemicals and communicate with their environment. And then there's pheromones. An ant can follow a chemical trail left by another ant using scent almost like we use a road sign. Imagine walking through a giant city where you couldn't read any signs, but instead you could smell invisible directions left behind by other people. Turn left, food this way, danger ahead. That would be your new world. You wouldn't simply be seeing your environment, you'd be constantly sensing it. Every surface, every smell, and every chemical signal could carry information. Your world would become smaller, but somehow much more complicated. So, would becoming the size of an ant be a superpower? Maybe, at least at first. You'd have an incredible strength-to-weight ratio. You could potentially survive falls that would be deadly for a human. But then reality would hit. Water could become dangerous, rain could become a serious threat. Breathing would work differently, and your familiar visual world would be replaced by a strange landscape of smells, chemicals, textures, and enormous obstacles. Being tiny wouldn't simply mean becoming a smaller human. It would mean entering an entirely different world governed by different physical rules. And if you think that's strange, wait until we reverse the experiment. What if insects weren't tiny anymore? What if an ant suddenly became the size of a human? That world might be a lot more terrifying. Subscribe for the next What If.